Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we anticipate the return of the House of Commons from the summer recess. There promises to be fireworks aplenty across the green benches, since the new Prime Minister's estimate of the chances of a no-deal Brexit have moved from 1 million to 1 during the recent Tory leadership election to touch and go at the G7 summit of last weekend. In the shadow of the Palace of Westminster, Alex turns to two of the UK's most respected political commentators to forecast the moves and counter-moves of the Brexiteers and the Remainers as the battle is joined for the final titanic struggle. In the blue corner, we have Peter Oborne. Nobody knows more than this man about the machinations of the Conservative Party.
We live, I don't need to remind you or Mr. Richards, in a representative democracy, a parliamentary democracy. Mr. Johnson is currently proposing to abolish that.
And we also turn to Steve Richards, who will estimate the chances of the opponents of a hard Brexit finally mobilising their parliamentary majority and knocking King Boris off his throne.
There has been considerable focus over what the various opponents of no deal disagree about, and there are many things they disagree about. But they agree by definition that they want to stop no deal.
But first to your messages, tweets and emails in relation to our show last week on the politics of protest. Saltire last says in relation to Theresa Duffus's interview from iAberdeen, "My friend, well done to her for getting the message out there. The dream shall never die." Dave says, "Glad to see Kev," and that's Kevin from Independence Live, "and the gang getting some well-deserved recognition for all their hard work day in and day out. Dedication to the cause." Mandrill says, "The time and energy to protest are luxuries that often only the wealthy or those with nothing left to lose can afford." Dean says, "Indie Camp, the People's Vigil to Scottish Independence, a great demonstration. The longest consecutive days and nights demo for Scotland's independence." Just a reminder from Dean about their work too. Sue says, "I'm afraid that the figures on the number of marchers stated on the programme are the ones quoted by all under one banner, the march organisers. Please be aware that video evidence is out there disproving those overinflated figures. 12,789 counted marching in Edinburgh, not 100,000. Well, Colin replied, "I was in the crowd at Edinburgh," he says, "and also many of these marches, and I can definitely confirm with the utmost confidence that the figures at Edinburgh were well above 100,000. Finally, Lynn says, "Thanks, Alex. It's about time we got some coverage." Now, there has never been a more anticipated parliamentary session where anything and everything is being speculated upon, from votes of confidence to cross-party parliamentary coups against the government, to government coups against the parliament, to the thought that Mr. Speaker Bercow himself might end up leading the parliamentary rebellion against the proroguing of Parliament proposed by the government. Parliament struck first this week with a cross-party Church House declaration stating the intent to block Parliament being suspended over the Brexit period. Downing Street struck back yesterday by announcing royal assent for shutting down Parliament pending a Queen's speech in mid-October, thus dramatically cutting down the opportunity for parliamentary initiatives. However, Parliament will still be meeting next week and may still attempt to seize control of the order paper from the government and attempt to legislate against a no-deal Brexit. It is clear that Mr. Bercow would facilitate such a move, describing the government's manoeuvring as an outrage. In addition, the courts may take a hand, with the Scottish court action led by the formidable Joanna Cherry QC already underway. However, Parliament's time to act has been severely limited by the government's move. No one can be sure how this drama will all play out over the next few weeks. However, to engage in some informed guesswork, Alex is joined at Victoria Tower Gardens by top political commentators Peter Oborne and Steve Richards. If anyone knows what's going to happen, then they will.
Well, you join us from Victoria Tower Gardens, right outside the Palace of Westminster, where next week the MPs return from their holidays for a dramatic denouement of the Brexit struggle. No one really knows what's going to happen. There's any number of permutations, but if anyone can help us understand it, then my two guests today can Peter Oborne and Steve Richards, two double doyens of political commentary. Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Peter, if anybody knows the inner workings of the Conservative Party, you do. So what is going on with Boris Johnson just now? Is he actually wanting a deal, or is he just preparing an election platform?
Mr. Johnson, I can assure you, really wants a deal. He's a very intelligent man. He's been a Brussels correspondent 30 years ago. He understands how Europe works, and I know that because I've talked to him about it quite a lot over many years. He knows that a no deal is the road to doom, a road to industrial devastation in this country. He knows the language of Europe as well. He can talk to Donald Tusk. We saw that over the weekend. He can talk to diplomats, to politicians. He got on well even with Macron. Of course he wants a deal. What he has also to handle, of course, is his rhetoric, the other audience which he has to deal with, which is the Conservative Party, very, very fanatical people who want no deal and don't want to have anything to do with Europe. And in order to become leader of the Conservative Party, he's had to hitch himself to the wagons of the Conservative Party. That is the dilemma we are in at the moment.
So, Steve, is that your reading of the situation, or do you think that Boris Johnson seems to be making demands of other Europeans that they can't possibly meet?
He is making demands which they can't meet. That doesn't mean that he doesn't want a deal. It is obviously a better solution for him if he could find one. But unusually for a new British Prime Minister, he has left himself no wriggle room.
But is there a game plan to taunt the other parties into a parliamentary vote to find a causa belli for an early election to go to the polls when the going's good?
I don't like talking about speculation in politics. What might somebody be doing or going into motivation? I just want to describe what you can see happening. And what you're seeing happening is a constitutional and political outrage, and they're entertaining the idea of no deal, which means the degradation of industrial Britain. It means thousands of people in Britain losing their jobs, maybe hundreds of thousands. Now, for Mr. Cummings, who lives in Northumberland on ample estates, he's not going to personally suffer. But, you know, the Sunderland car worker will lose his job or her job. And that's what I find a bit sick, a bit ill-making about what's going on at the moment.
In terms of constitutional vandalism, that threat of it, at least, the idea of proroguing Parliament so that it couldn't do anything about the deadline of Halloween for Brexit, that seems to have brought the opposition parties together. How do you rate the Church House declaration of this Tuesday as a sign that the opposition are getting their act together?
I think it's significant because there has been considerable focus over what the various opponents of no deal disagree about, and there are many things they disagree about, but they agree by definition that they want to stop no deal.
Proroguing Parliament, is this a feint by the government to keep the opposition parties guessing, or are they seriously considering driving through a Brexit with Parliament not even sitting?
The mere fact that at the greatest peacetime crisis in British politics since World War II, Mr. Johnson is entertaining the idea of getting rid of Parliament is quite staggering, amazing, and it says a great deal about the client nature of the British press, that they aren't worried about this. We live, I don't need to remind you or Mr. Richards, in a representative democracy, a parliamentary democracy. Mr. Johnson is currently proposing to abolish that. And it staggers me that the Telegraph newspaper, which used to stand up to what Britain stands for, the Times newspaper, just seems to go along with this idea that we suddenly move ourselves on to an elected dictatorship.
But wouldn't that maximise I mean, if you remember, Rory Stewart, very famously in the Conservative leadership campaign, said that he'd be marching out of Parliament with the Speaker, no doubt, in the van, given Speaker Bercow's views. Wouldn't you just maximise the opposition by undertaking a manoeuvre such as that?
I like to think that there are honourable MPs, such as Mr. Stewart, the SNP. I think Nicola Sturgeon's been excellent on this, such as Jeremy Corbyn, who's been absolutely clear about that, and Joe Swinson, who seems to be waking up after a long period of negligence, are concerned about that kind of issue.
What do you think, Steve Richards? I mean, this proroguing thing, it does strike you as a bit of a manoeuvre, a bit of a conjuring trick, doesn't it? I mean,
You mustn't. We mustn't think how clever they are. We mustn't go into the sordid motives, because we can only guess at those. We can look at the actual constitutional decency and the honour of the way people are behaving.
Well, let's take it this way.
Yeah.
I mean, we had the opposition last week finding it very difficult to even agree on who might be a caretaker Prime Minister for a period of time, and spending their time saying, well, not that one, not that one. This week, however, we saw the opposition, the disparate opposition, coming together in their church house decoration. I mean, the one thing that's got them absolutely united is the threat of Parliament being suspended. So what would be the government's interest in actually doing something that would maximise the opposition?
It would be an act of such provocation, as Peter suggests, that while it is hazardous to predict what's going to happen next on any front in this drama, it would bring the Conservative rebels together. They've stated absolutely that although they have doubts on a vote of confidence, they are utterly opposed, for the reasons Peter suggests, to the arbitrary proroguing of Parliament. And it would be also, I mean, when the main Brexit case was that this Westminster Parliament was meant to be sovereign against a somewhat mythologised view of the European Union, to then abolish that very Parliament to get through Brexit, I think will be an act too far. But when you say, can these disparate people unite around their opposition to that, without hesitation, yes. All the debates are about the mechanisms. How do you stop a government from doing such a thing? How do you stop a government determined to go out with a no deal if that's what happens? But are they theoretically united to stop the proroguing of Parliament and to stop no deal? Yes, and I think the sense of that will intensify over the coming weeks rather than the opposite. They can't agree on a vote of confidence. They don't agree that the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, should become short-term Prime Minister. But they do agree on these other matters, and they will find a way, I think, to make that absolutely clear.
Now, if that does happen, Peter Oborne, without speculating on motives, but if that happens, if the opposition move to control the agenda again, to pass legislation, to threaten to delay the Brexit deadline once again, wouldn't that be basically lighting the blue touch paper for Boris Johnson to call an election?
I think it might, and I'm not sure that I think he might be entitled in those hypothetical circumstances to do exactly that. And I think the logic of this situation, where you have a minority Prime Minister trying to enforce his will over a Parliament which disagrees with him, the natural outcome of that would be an election. We are in a parliamentary democracy. Nobody could object to that.
Join us after the break, where we'll pursue the point if there is indeed an early election, perhaps even one before the Halloween Brexit deadline, what might be the outcome? And we'll also look at the elephant in the political discussion. Are many of these political decisions being made in the backcloth of a looming world recession and the impact that would have on domestic politics? Welcome back. You join us again in Victoria Tower Gardens, where we're discussing the prospects of an early election with Peter Oborne and Steve Richards. Steve, is it likely, given the circumstances of the opposition parties in managing to seize the parliamentary agenda to prevent a hard Brexit, that in itself would provoke an early election?
It might, but one of the problems when you start going down any of these routes is you see all the political explosions that might erupt around it. And there is a very big problem about calling an election before Britain has left the European Union. I think from the Conservative point of view, the Brexit Party would stand. We've heard Nigel Farage this week say Johnson is not to be trusted. And that is one risk. More generally, early elections in British politics rarely turn out as the caller of that election expects. but there are many other problems. So while it seems to me this Parliament is paralysed and can't reach any agreement on anything, I still see problems with that early election before October the 31st. If it was happening, if Britain were to crash out during an election campaign, the problem there is no deal will have happened. There is quite a likely prospect of chaos from day one. So I see big problems with an early election, but I fully accept that this Westminster Parliament cannot pass virtually anything, domestic legislation as well as the Brexit-related stuff. So you can see the argument for it, but I can see big arguments against, and I'm afraid that's all I can say at this moment. It's very hard to predict.
So an early election would have substantial risks. But unlike his predecessor, Theresa May, who called an election for reasons which seemed very curious when she had a majority in Parliament and perhaps paid a price for it, that Boris Johnson, under these circumstances, would be calling an election having been beaten in the House of Commons, with the Parliament seizing control of Brexit. Wouldn't he have the ideal platform to say it's Parliament against the people?
I think that's what they are considering, which is that the people voted for Brexit 3 years ago. Parliament has been backed by Brussels. They wouldn't just say it was Parliament against the people. It would be Parliament and Brussels.
The collaborators.
That very ugly phrase, deliberately used recently by the Prime Minister himself, about collaboration to conjure up those people who got along well with the Axis powers in World War II. It's a part of the debasement of our public discourse. But I think that's what he would try and do, and I think you would then get several things would happen. One is that there would be a mutiny inside the Conservative Party. I think quite a lot of Tory MPs, including potentially Theresa May, but certainly I think Philip Hammond, i.e. the former Prime Minister and Chancellor, but lots of others, Rory Stewart is another one, would actually not stand in the Conservative interest. And so you get a split in the Conservative Party. You would also get a split in Labour. There's a number of Labour MPs, Kate Hoey, others in the North East, who feel that Brexit should take place, honourably so. They're reflecting the views of that constituent. So you get both parties splitting. It would be quite chaotic. And I think that and once again, what you have here is Mr. Johnson is very, very determined, well advised, and very well financed. He's got the big donors, the hedge fund managers, the international trash capital are behind Johnson, and that means a lot in an election campaign. They can buy the advertising, they can do the Facebook stuff, and against that, you've got a divided Labour Party.
But how about the theory which some prominent journalists like yourself, Peter, have been putting forward, about the connection between the politics of Brexit and the possibility, perhaps even the probability, of a serious world economic recession? Now, most people talk about Brexit as provoking economic dislocation, but isn't the timing of when you'd want to have an election rather governed by your expectations on the economy?
I definitely think that we live in a very dangerous moment in world history. We've always had recessions. They come along every so often. We had one in 1990, we had one in 2008, and it's part of the way that you're a former economist, you know how capitalism works. It needs recessions, like you cut down dead trees. But what I think is very frightening about the current situation is the sheer levels of debt which almost every country in the world, barring Germany, has assembled, and the very low interest rates, because what you have normally in a recession is that the central bankers and the international treasuries, they get together, they produce interest rates and they print money and splurge spending in order to adjust Keynesian economics, and that isn't available to us. Interest rates are now at rock bottom, and debt is at an astronomical level. I think that I'm right in saying that something like the level of debt in the world is 3 times as much as the global national outputs. In other words, they haven't got any firepower. It's like you can't fight a recession because all you've got is pop guns.
So, will Boris Johnson be, when he's thinking about this late at night, will he be most haunted by his predecessor, Theresa May, who called an unnecessary election and lost the majority? Or will he be remembering Gordon Brown, who didn't take advantage of a honeymoon period when he seemed to have an opportunity to dash to the polls? What will be the most influential president?
Both. Both. And he will be thinking of both. The Theresa May one is a real warning that opinion polls can guide people towards their doom. She never recovered from calling that election. At the beginning, she was 20 points ahead. The Gordon Brown one is a warning on two fronts. First of all, if you allow election speculation to get out of hand, you lose all control. He could call one and lose it. He could not call one and look pathetic and weak. So he's got to decide very quickly either to kill off this speculation unequivocally or call one. Both have risks. Obviously, if he were to win it, it will be a triumphant course. But none of us, including him, can know that as he contemplates these moves late at night.
Peter Oborne, you've been very critical of many aspects of the politics of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader. But he did show in the last general election that as a campaigner, he exceeded people's expectations many times over. Do you think Jeremy Corbyn in an election framework could pull that off again? Or do you think when it comes to taking on BoJo that Jeremy has lost his mojo?
Well, I think that you're right, Mr. Corbyn was an amazing, he showed us all fools, made us all fools. He is good on the campaign trail. There is something, they look at Jeremy Corbyn and people do, and they think, compare him to Mrs. May, he was amazing. How would Corbyn match up to Boris? At the moment, Boris is very new. He hasn't been properly exposed. He produces this kind of charisma and glamour. And he might be a little bit powerful against Corbyn. I think that's what Mr. Johnson's advisors will be telling him.
So, Steve Richards, we've looked at a number of permutations for the immediate parliamentary action, a number of ways we could get to an election, or maybe not. And the Brexit deadline is looming. So now you're on the spot. We've said what might happen. What's going to happen?
Well, look, none of us knows. We've said many, many times. But I think if it looks as if the UK is heading for no deal, there will be an attempt for Parliament to seize control of the executive, and that attempt will succeed. The Speaker will facilitate it, and a majority will vote for it. And then there will be legislation instructing the Prime Minister to negotiate a 6-month extension. And that too will get a majority in the House of Commons if it looks as if no deal is the only other route. What happens after that, I cannot begin to speculate. In other words, will the government declare that they're going to ignore it and, as some constitutional experts suggest, break the law? Or will they win some legal battle that suggests that they have legal prerogative? I don't know about that, but that, I think, is what will happen if it looks as if by October the 31st Britain is about to leave with no deal.
Now, Peter, last time you were sitting in this green speculating, you forecast this autumn would be the biggest constitutional battle since the English Civil War. Are you holding to that, and what's going to happen?
Yeah, I do. Well, I do hold to that. This is the most momentous moment. It's quite frightening. Any sensible person should be kept awake at night.
Yeah.
One thing I'd add to Steve Richards, who's very knowledgeable, he didn't take into account Europe. I mean, Europe might just say, actually, we're fed up with you, and they won't they won't give us an extension. We need them to do that. Mr. Macron might just say, well, look, actually, this has gone on long enough, and off you go. I think that's quite a real possibility. And the other one is, and I think it's the most likely outcome, despite everything, is that Mr. Johnson is a very intelligent man. He understands Europe quite well. He wants a deal. And so my prediction is we're going to get a version of Mrs. May's deal from Mr. Johnson, who did so much to destroy it.
Well, a huge number of permutations, possible outcomes over the next few months. One thing's for sure, there's going to be plenty to write about and plenty to commentate on. But thank you so much, Peter Oborne and Steve Richards, for your insights. Thank you. The only political certainty now is uncertainty. and the only absolute is confusion. As we have heard from our top commentators, it is doubtful that the opposition parties have the parliamentary firepower to knock over the Johnson administration in a vote of confidence, but it is likely they have the votes to derail a no-deal Brexit. Meanwhile, the government likely has the votes to see off a no-confidence motion, but less likely to be able to sustain their European brinkmanship against a hostile and suspicious House of Commons. Thus, the brazen move this week to prorogue Parliament before a new session and the Queen's speech in mid-October, dramatically reducing the time available for Parliament to act against the government. Thus, the Prime Minister hopes to simultaneously ratchet up the pressure on his opponents in the House of Commons to put up or shut up, and on other Europeans to give him a deal he can actually sell. This is a politically combustible situation, which will not be contained for long, nor is it likely to wait for a Halloween denouement. This year, the fireworks will be before Halloween, not afterwards. In 2017, Theresa May called a shock election and lost her parliamentary majority. She claimed all the other political parties were the saboteurs of Brexit. In 2019, her successor has no parliamentary majority and describes other parties as the collaborators with the rest of Europe. Johnson claims to have no plans to call an election because every sign of being in full campaign mode. The opposition don't have the numbers to force an election through a vote of confidence. However, they can still seize control of the parliamentary agenda and attempt to block a no-deal Brexit, in which case they will very possibly end up with an election anyway, but this time one called by the government. At present, the Prime Minister would go into such an election with an opinion poll lead, but absolutely nothing can be taken as read in this turbulent political autumn. As someone prone to quoting heroic lines from half-remembered classroom poetry, Boris Johnson may consider himself as the Horatius holding the bridge, but he might end up resembling some lines from Casabianca, the ones about the boy on the burning deck. Next week, we take a closer look at the gathering economic storm clouds with Professor David Blanchflower, the sole voice in the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee who warned of the Great Recession of 10 years ago. He describes the last decade as the slowest economic recovery since the South Sea bubble and warns of much tougher economic times to come. Until then, from Taz and me and all at the show, it's goodbye for now.